Remember Saturday mornings in front of the TV, watching the Roadrunner outsmart Wile E. Coyote with anvils, dynamite, and elaborate ACME contraptions? Those cartoons were hilarious, violent, and absolutely everywhere in the 1960s and 70s. Then something changed. By the mid-1980s, those same cartoons you'd watched as a kid were suddenly getting chopped up, scenes removed, entire gags cut out. If you noticed the edits and wondered what happened, you weren't imagining things. This is why the Roadrunner cartoons were heavily edited in the 1980s. The Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote debuted in 1949 with a short called Fast and Furious, created by Chuck Jones and writer Michael Maltese at Warner Brothers. The premise was simple and brilliant. A coyote tries to catch a roadrunner using increasingly elaborate and inevitably failing methods. No dialogue, just sound effects and music. The coyote falls off cliffs, gets crushed by boulders, blown up by dynamite, flattened by steamrollers, and subjected to every form of cartoon violence imaginable. For the next 15 years, Chuck Jones and his team at Warner Brothers produced dozens of Roadrunner shorts. They followed strict rules that Jones established. The Roadrunner never harms the coyote directly. All the violence is self-inflicted due to the coyote's own incompetence. The action takes place in the American Southwest, and the coyote's tools always come from the ACME Corporation. These rules created a perfect formula for comedy that worked remarkably well. The cartoons were shown in theaters before feature films throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. They were enormously popular with audiences of all ages. The humor worked on multiple levels. Kids laughed at the physical comedy and the coyote's failures, while adults appreciated the clever timing, the satirical take on American consumer culture with ACME products, and the existential quality of the coyote's endless, doomed pursuit. When television became dominant in American homes during the 1960s, Warner Brothers started licensing their cartoon library to TV networks. The Roadrunner shorts became staples of Saturday morning cartoon programming and weekday afternoon shows. Kids who'd seen them in theaters could now watch them at home, and a whole new generation grew up with the coyote's misadventures as part of their daily viewing. The cartoons aired unedited through most of the 1960s and into the 1970s. Nobody questioned the violence because it was clearly cartoon violence, unrealistic and consequence-free. The coyote could fall 5,000 feet, create a coyote-shaped hole in the ground, then pop back up for the next scene. He was immortal, indestructible, a metaphor for persistence in the face of constant failure. The violence was the joke, not something to be concerned about. But American attitudes toward television content, particularly children's programming, began shifting in the late 1960s. The change started with concerns about the amount of violence children were seeing on TV generally. Not just cartoons, but news coverage of the Vietnam War, crime dramas, westerns, and action shows. Parents and educators started asking whether all this violence was affecting children's behavior. In 1968, the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence was established following the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. The commission studied many aspects of American society, including the role of media violence. Their report, issued in 1969, suggested that exposure to television violence could increase aggressive behavior in children. The findings were controversial and not conclusive, but they started a conversation that would dominate media discussions for the next 2 decades. Action for Children's Television, or ACT, was founded in 1968 by a group of concerned mothers in Massachusetts. They lobbied the Federal Communications Commission in Congress to regulate children's programming, reduce violence and commercialism, and improve the educational content of shows aimed at young viewers. ACT became increasingly influential throughout the 1970s, meeting with network executives and putting public pressure on broadcasters to change their programming practices. The networks responded cautiously. They didn't want government regulation, so they tried to head it off through self-regulation. They created standards and practices departments, basically internal censors who reviewed programming for potentially objectionable content. For Saturday morning cartoons, this meant new guidelines about what could and couldn't be shown. The guidelines focused heavily on imitable behavior, actions that children might try to copy at home. The concern was that kids might not understand that cartoon violence wasn't real, that they might try to recreate what they saw on screen and hurt themselves or others. Never mind that children had been watching cartoons for decades without widespread incidents of kids dropping anvils on each other. The theoretical possibility was enough to justify intervention. By the late 1970s, the networks were already asking animation studios to tone down violence in new productions. Hanna-Barbera and other studios adapted by creating gentler cartoons with less physical conflict. But the older cartoons in the Warner Brothers library posed a problem. They'd been made in a different era with different standards, and they were full of exactly the kind of content that the new guidelines prohibited. The situation intensified in the early 1980s. Several factors converged to create what amounted to a moral panic about cartoon violence. Parent advocacy groups were more organized and vocal. The Reagan administration, despite its deregulatory philosophy in most areas, was responsive to conservative family values groups who wanted cleaner television. And critically, there were a few high-profile incidents where children were injured trying to imitate things they'd seen on TV, though none specifically involved Roadrunner cartoons. The networks that aired the Roadrunner shorts, primarily CBS, ABC, and various local stations buying syndication packages, faced a choice. They could stop airing the cartoons entirely, which would mean losing popular programming that filled time slots and attracted viewers. Or they could edit the cartoons to remove the most problematic content. They chose editing. The editing process began in earnest around 1983 to 1984. Warner Brothers either performed the edits themselves or allowed the networks to do it, depending on the licensing arrangements. The goal was to remove scenes showing dangerous behavior that children might imitate, while keeping enough content to make the cartoons still function as entertainment. Certain types of gags were deemed too dangerous and were routinely cut. Any scene showing explosives being handled, particularly dynamite or bombs, was considered imitable and often removed. The coyote lighting a fuse, placing dynamite, or detonating explosives, all of that became problematic under the new standards. Given how many Roadrunner cartoons featured dynamite as a key element, this meant substantial cuts. The irony was that real children couldn't access dynamite or explosives. The danger was theoretical at best, but the standards and practices departments weren't evaluating actual risk. They were responding to advocacy groups who pointed to these scenes as examples of inappropriate content. The mere depiction of explosives, regardless of context or accessibility, became grounds for removal. Scenes involving fire were similarly targeted. The coyote painting a tunnel entrance on a rock wall and then running into it was fine. The coyote setting fire to things or being set on fire was not. This eliminated entire sequences from various shorts where fire was used as a comedic element. The painted tunnel gag, incidentally, remained acceptable because it was understood as pure fantasy. No child could actually paint a tunnel entrance and fool someone into running into solid rock. The distinction between what was considered imitable versus what was recognized as impossible became a key factor in editing decisions, though the line wasn't always logical or consistent. Any gag involving electricity, particularly scenes where the coyote was electrocuted, became questionable. The concern was that children might not understand the danger of electricity and might try to recreate electrical experiments they saw in cartoons. Scenes where the coyote stuck his claws into electrical sockets or was zapped by ACME electrical devices were frequently trimmed. The guidelines around falls were more complicated. Falling off cliffs was central to the Roadrunner formula. It happened in nearly every short. The editors couldn't remove all falling scenes without destroying the cartoons completely. Instead, they focused on particularly elaborate or prolonged fall sequences, especially ones where the coyote appeared to suffer on the way down or showed fear before impact. Quick falls where the coyote immediately disappeared off screen were more acceptable than lingering shots of him plummeting. Scenes showing knives, scissors, or sharp objects pointing at characters were cut. This was part of a broader prohibition against showing weapons in ways that could be imitated. The coyote attempting to cut the Roadrunner with giant scissors or threatening him with sharp objects, those scenes disappeared from broadcasts. Any sequence suggesting that children might play on or near roads, railroad tracks, or other dangerous locations was removed or shortened. Some Roadrunner cartoons featured gags involving the coyote standing on railroad tracks or roads, waiting for the Roadrunner. Under the new standards, these were considered problematic because they might normalize playing in dangerous locations. The removal of individual scenes created new problems. The Roadrunner cartoons had been carefully timed, with musical scores and sound effects synchronized to the action. When editors removed 30 seconds of footage, they'd create an awkward jump in the music or a sequence that no longer made narrative sense. Sometimes they'd try to bridge these gaps by cutting differently or by adding extra footage of the Roadrunner running or the coyote looking confused. Other times they'd just accept the jarring edit and move on. Viewers who'd grown up watching the unedited versions noticed immediately that something was off. The timing felt wrong. Jokes didn't land properly because the setup had been removed. In some cases, entire shorts were reduced from 7 minutes to 5 minutes or less, with multiple scenes excised. The cartoons still functioned, but they weren't the same. The manic energy and perfect comic timing that Chuck Jones had crafted was disrupted. Adults watching with their children would sometimes feel confused, remembering scenes that were no longer there. They'd wait for a particular gag they remembered from childhood, only to have the cartoon skip over it entirely. This created an odd phenomenon, where parents' memories of the cartoons didn't match what their children were seeing, leading to questions about whether the parents were misremembering or whether something had actually changed. Animation enthusiasts and cartoon fans were particularly frustrated. They understood what had been lost when scenes were removed, not just individual jokes, but the cumulative rhythm and pacing that made the cartoons work as cohesive pieces of comedy. Chuck Jones had been a master of timing, and the edits were essentially vandalizing his work. Some cartoons were edited so heavily that they were effectively destroyed. Shorts that relied heavily on explosives or fire or other now prohibited elements might have 3 or 4 minutes of a 7-minute cartoon removed. These heavily butchered versions were often pulled from rotation entirely because they didn't work anymore. This reduced the number of Roadrunner cartoons in circulation, meaning the remaining ones were repeated more frequently, which made viewers notice the repetition more. Local stations sometimes made their own additional edits beyond what the networks had done. Syndication packages came with cartoons that had already been edited for network broadcast, but individual stations might have their own standards that were even stricter. This created a situation where the same cartoon might exist in multiple versions, edited differently depending on where and when it aired. The editing process wasn't always consistent. Different editors at different times made different choices about what to cut. A scene that was removed from one broadcast might remain in another. This inconsistency was confusing for viewers and frustrating for Warner Brothers, who saw their carefully crafted cartoons being treated arbitrarily. Chuck Jones himself was reportedly furious about the editing. He'd created the Roadrunner cartoons with specific comedic timing and structure. The edits disrupted that structure, destroying jokes he'd spent months perfecting. He understood that standards had changed, but he felt the edits were excessive and misguided. In interviews later in his life, he defended the original cartoons as harmless fantasy that children understood as such. Jones had spent his entire career perfecting the art of animation timing. He knew exactly how long to hold on a shot, when to cut, how to build to a punchline. The editors making cuts in the 1980s didn't have that expertise or understanding. They were following guidelines about content, not thinking about comic rhythm or narrative flow. From Jones's perspective, they were taking a finely tuned machine and randomly removing parts, then wondering why it didn't work as smoothly. Other animators and directors from the golden age of Warner Brothers cartoons shared Jones's frustration. They'd worked in an era when animation was an art form that didn't talk down to its audience. The idea that their cartoons needed to be censored to protect children seemed insulting, both to them as artists and to children as viewers capable of distinguishing fantasy from reality. The edited versions created a strange situation where the Roadrunner cartoons existed in multiple states simultaneously. Original theatrical prints remained unedited in archives and collections. Home video releases in the 1980s and 1990s sometimes used the edited versions, sometimes the originals, depending on licensing arrangements and concerns about controversy. Viewers never quite knew which version they'd encounter. As VCRs became common in the mid to late 1980s, some collectors started recording the older, unedited versions whenever they aired, recognizing that they were disappearing from broadcast. These personal archives preserved the cartoons in their original form, though for many people, the edited versions became the only ones they knew. The editing continued through the rest of the 1980s and into the 1990s. By the mid-1990s, attitudes started shifting again. There was growing recognition that the moral panic about cartoon violence had been overblown. Academic studies failed to find strong evidence that watching cartoon violence caused real-world aggression in children. The generation that had grown up watching unedited Warner Brothers cartoons in the 1960s and 70s didn't show any particular tendency toward violence compared to later generations. Cable channels like Cartoon Network, which launched in 1992, began airing more complete versions of the classic Warner Brothers cartoons. They still made some edits, but they were more selective, focusing on content that was genuinely offensive by modern standards, racial stereotypes, for instance, rather than comic violence that was clearly fantastic. The Roadrunner cartoons largely returned to their original form on these channels. The DVD era, beginning in the late 1990s and early 2000s, finally made the unedited cartoons widely available again. Warner Brothers released comprehensive collections of their classic cartoons, including the Roadrunner shorts in their original theatrical versions. For people who'd grown up with the edited broadcast versions, seeing the complete cartoons was sometimes a revelation. Suddenly, jokes made sense, timing worked properly, and the brilliant craftsmanship of Chuck Jones and his team was visible again. Looking back from today's perspective, the heavy editing of Roadrunner cartoons in the 1980s seems like an overreaction to legitimate but exaggerated concerns. Parents and advocacy groups were worried about media influence on children, which wasn't unreasonable. But the response, cutting up classic cartoons that had entertained generations without apparent harm, went too far. The edits didn't make children safer. They just made the cartoons worse. The Roadrunner editing controversy was part of a broader cultural anxiety about childhood in the 1980s. This was the era of stranger danger panics, extensive childproofing, and increasing supervision of children's activities. The permissive attitudes of the 1960s and 70s gave way to more protective parenting styles. Editing the cartoons fit into this larger pattern of trying to shield children from anything potentially harmful, even when the threat was more theoretical than real. The network's decision to edit rather than simply stop airing the cartoons showed their commercial calculation. The Roadrunner shorts were valuable programming. They attracted viewers, filled time slots, and cost relatively little compared to producing new content. Editing allowed the networks to keep airing them while appearing responsive to parent concerns. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed business to continue. For the generation that grew up watching the edited versions in the 1980s, the Roadrunner cartoons were still entertaining, but they were missing something ineffable. Kids at the time might not have known exactly what was wrong, but they could sense that the timing was off, that jokes seemed incomplete, that something wasn't quite right. Only later, when they encountered the unedited versions, did they realize what had been lost? The editing also affected how the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote were perceived by younger audiences. With much of the extreme violence removed, the cartoons became somewhat gentler, less manic, less edge-of-your-seat chaotic. The Coyotes' failures seemed less catastrophic, which arguably made them less funny. The whole point of the cartoons was the extreme nature of the violence and the Coyotes' resilience in surviving it. Softening that softened the humor. Today, the Roadrunner cartoons exist in a peculiar state. The unedited versions are available on streaming services and in physical media collections. But many people's memories of the cartoons are shaped by the edited versions they saw as children or showed their own children in the 1980s and 90s. This creates generational differences in how the cartoons are remembered and discussed. The experience of watching the Roadrunner cartoons became stratified by generation. People who watched them in the 1950s and 60s saw them in theaters in their original form. People who watched them in the 1970s saw them unedited on television. People who watched them in the 1980s saw heavily edited versions. People who watched them from the mid-1990s onward could again access the complete versions. Each generation had a slightly different experience of ostensibly the same cartoons. The Roadrunner editing story is part of a larger history of how American culture has approached children's media. We've oscillated between permissiveness and protectiveness, between trusting children to understand fantasy and trying to shield them from anything potentially concerning. The 1980s represented a peak of protectiveness, a moment when fears about media influence were strong enough to justify cutting up classic cartoons that had been entertaining audiences for decades. For those of us who remember watching the cartoons in their original form, the edited versions of the 1980s felt like a loss. Something funny and chaotic and perfectly timed had been bureaucratized, sanitized, made safe in ways that drained the life from it. The Coyote's endless suffering was the joke, and trying to make his suffering less intense was missing the entire point. You can't make cartoon violence safer without making it not cartoon violence anymore, and at that point, why bother? The good news is that the original cartoons survived. Chuck Jones's vision wasn't permanently lost, just temporarily obscured. Anyone who wants to watch the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote in all their violent, hilarious glory can do so now without the clumsy edits that marred broadcasts in the 1980s. The cartoons have outlasted the moral panic that tried to soften them, which seems fitting. Like the Coyote himself, they survived the forces trying to destroy them and kept going. If you enjoyed this look back at Saturday morning censorship and the battle over cartoon violence, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.